NASA called it junk. Harvard almost missed it. But an 8-year-old boy drew something on a napkin. That changed everything. The night James changed everything was, at first glance, entirely forgettable. It was just another quiet evening inside a NASA research facility, the kind of place no camera crews visited, the kind that smelled of old metal and dish soap. Grace Thompson, a cafeteria worker on the night shift, scrubbed trays under flickering lights while her son James, 8 years old and soft-spoken, waited in the corner with a stack of napkins and a few broken-colored pencils. He didn't draw cartoons, or superheroes, or animals. He drew loops, curving spirals, repeating arcs, strange overlapping structures that seemed to twist inward and bloom outward at the same time, like something trying to breathe on paper. He didn't know why he drew them. He just knew it helped him think, especially about his dad. His father, Robert Thompson, had worked in the systems division at NASA. A quiet man. Too quiet in the end. James didn't fully understand the word cancer, but he remembered his dad whispering to him from a hospital bed before he passed. If you learn how to keep energy from destroying itself, you might learn how to keep people too. James didn't know what that meant, but it stayed. That night, as the last dishwasher cycle hummed and his mother stacked silver trays, James folded one of his drawings, a wrinkled napkin salt, into a paper airplane. It had wide wings and a heavy nose. It wouldn't fly far, but it glided when he launched it, as if it had its own breath. "Time to go, sweetheart," Grace called from the back. James nodded. But before grabbing his backpack, he turned toward the door and gave the plane one last toss across the room. He didn't know someone else was standing on the other side. Professor Charles Bennett had not expected to find a miracle in a cafeteria. He was a visiting physicist from Harvard, there for a collaborative energy symposium with NASA's systems department. The tour had been dull. Government graphs, funding charts, lifeless hallways. But when the paper plane slid to a stop at his feet, something tugged at him. He bent to pick it up. Reflex, not curiosity. And then he stopped breathing. Drawn in faint pencil across a wrinkled napkin was an energy loop. Not just a doodle, a closed kinetic model with no measurable loss, something his team had been stuck on for 4 years. Only this version was simpler, cleaner. It made intuitive sense. His fingers trembled. Behind him, the rest of the Harvard group moved on, chatting about logistics. But Bennett didn't move. He stood, frozen in a cafeteria hallway, clutching a napkin that had no business existing. He turned it over again and again. No signature, no notes, just soft pencil strokes, and something that felt alive. He looked up. A small boy was leaving, holding his mother's hand, not looking back. "Excuse me," Bennett called after the woman. "Wait, please." Grace paused. She looked tired, worn, her apron stained from long hours. But her voice was kind. "Yes?" "This—" Bennett held up the napkin. "This drawing. Do you know who made it?" She blinked, then laughed gently. Not mocking, just surprised. "Oh, that'd be my son. James." "James," Bennett repeated slowly. "How old is he?" 8. Bennett stared. "Did someone teach him to do this?" She shook her head. "He just draws. Ever since his dad passed. Helps him sleep, I think." Bennett glanced down at the napkin again. No child should be able to do this. But there it was. Undeniable. "Would it be all right?" he asked carefully. "If I spoke to him?" Grace hesitated, then nodded toward the doorway. "He's shy, and it's past bedtime." Bennett turned and saw the boy crouched near a bench, tying his shoes. There was something almost serene about him, like he didn't quite belong in the noise of the world. He approached slowly. "Hi," he said, kneeling beside him. "I'm Charles." The boy looked up, wide-eyed but calm. "I'm James. I saw your airplane. Did it hit something?" Bennett chuckled. "No, but it landed somewhere important." He sat beside him, gently unfolding the napkin. "This," he said, "is beautiful." James tilted his head. "It's just a spiral." "Did your dad teach you this?" James looked down. "He used to draw things. Said it helped energy breathe." Bennett felt his throat tighten. "Do you draw a lot?" James nodded. "When I miss him." There was a silence then, not uncomfortable, just full. Bennett folded the napkin again, hands careful. "James," he said softly, "would you like to visit Harvard one day?" James's eyes lit up. "Is that a school?" "It's a place where people try to understand things." "Do they use chalk?" Bennett smiled. "A lot of chalk. I like chalk." Grace called again, gently. "Let's go, honey." James stood, backpack slung. He waved. Bennett didn't wave back. He just watched, holding the napkin like a secret. Around him, the hallway buzzed back to life. Lights flickered. Cleaning crews passed by. But something had shifted, and he didn't yet know what. That night, Bennett didn't sleep. He copied the drawing, scanned it, and sent it to 2 colleagues at Harvard. Dr. Helen Sun, expert in applied energy systems, and Dr. Malcolm Rhodes from experimental physics. He didn't tell them who drew it, only that it had been found in an unlikely place. 3 days later, their replies arrived. Helen: "Whoever sketched this has an intuitive grasp of rotational dampening. This is graduate-level work. Where did you find this?" Rhodes: "Overlay it on the Durac model. It fits. This changes everything." But Bennett didn't reply. Not yet. He just stared at the napkin now pinned to the corkboard in his office. Coffee stain in one corner, faint smudge in the spiral's curve. He knew what he had to do, and it terrified him. Tomorrow he would walk into a government proposal meeting with that napkin, not as a theory, as evidence, of something bigger than numbers, of a boy who didn't even know he was brilliant, of a memory passed through a father's whisper, of a pattern that had finally found its way home. Dr. Charles Bennett had presented hundreds of models in his life. None had made his hands shake. But this one, this napkin, this quiet spiral drawn by a child, had turned everything he thought he understood upside down. The conference room was sterile and cold. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A dozen scientists sat stiffly in tailored suits, staring at the projection screen. Bennett stood in front of them, hands in pockets, heartbeat thudding. "I want to put forward a new model," he said simply. A few raised brows, a couple of murmurs. Bennett reached into his coat, pulled out the napkin, and placed it beneath the document camera. One man snorted. "This is a joke, right?" But when the projection lit up the wall, when they saw the elegance of the spiral, the way the loops nested without loss, the room fell still. He didn't explain where it came from. He didn't need to. The math spoke louder than provenance. As Bennett traced the loops with a laser pointer, explaining the vector curves, the inner resonance structure, the silent harmony buried in what looked like child's play, something shifted. One of the senior reviewers leaned forward. "Where's this been hiding?" Bennett paused, then smiled faintly. "In a cafeteria." That night, he returned to his office and found an envelope on his desk. No return address. Inside, one sheet of paper. No greeting. No sign-off, just a sentence. Withdraw the napkin. Or we will. Bennett stared at it for a long time. The air around him went colder than the room allowed. Then slowly, deliberately, he packed his coat, picked up his bag, and booked a train ticket without telling anyone. 6 hours later, the train pulled into a quiet Midwestern town coated in frost and quiet. Bennett walked the 3 blocks to the research facility cafeteria where he'd first seen the boy. Everything felt slower here, like the clocks ticked a little more honestly. He stepped into the break room, still holding the napkin. The vending machine buzzed just as it had that night. Same hum, same corner. He sat on the bench where James had once tied his shoes. The napkin in his pocket suddenly felt heavier than paper. 20 minutes later, Grace Thompson walked through the staff entrance, apron folded under one arm. Her steps slowed when she saw him. "Did something happen?" she asked, gentle but wary. "No," Bennett said. "Nothing bad. I just had to come back." Grace tilted her head. "Why?" He pulled the napkin out again and held it gently. "I think your son drew something extraordinary." She gave a tired smile. "James draws a lot of things. It's how he thinks." "No," Bennett said. "I mean truly extraordinary. This matches a theoretical energy model my colleagues have been struggling with for years. We've spent millions chasing it. He drew it, like it was nothing." She looked at the napkin, then back at him. "You came all this way," she said softly, "for a napkin." He shook his head. "I came all this way for your son." James arrived an hour later, chewing a granola bar, backpack slipping off one shoulder. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Bennett. "You came back," he said quietly. Bennett smiled. "You threw something at me I wasn't ready for." James giggled. "I didn't mean to hit you." "You didn't," Bennett replied. "But you hit something else." He handed the napkin to the boy. James sat cross-legged on the cafeteria floor and looked at it. "I was thinking about Dad," he said simply. "How he used to say energy could curl like water." Grace sat beside her son and placed a gentle hand on his back. "James," she said, "Professor Bennett thinks what you drew might help a lot of people." James looked up. "Like how?" Bennett crouched beside him. "Like powering machines with less waste, like building systems that don't overheat. Maybe even helping people who are sick." James went quiet. "Would you want to show someone how you did it?" James thought for a moment, then nodded. "But only if I don't have to wear a tie." Bennett laughed. "Deal." Outside, a man sat in a black sedan, watching through tinted glass. He held a phone to his ear. "He came back," the voice said. A pause. "No, the boy doesn't know yet, but the professor does, and he's trying to bring the kid in." Another pause. "Should we stop it?" On the other end, the reply came cold, flat. "Not yet. Let them think they're ahead. We'll be ready." The next morning, James woke before the sun. Grace found him in the living room, cross-legged on the floor, drawing, not on napkins, but on the backs of old paper placemats she'd brought home from work. Dozens of them, loops, spirals, arrows, grids, patterns like mazes. "You're up early," she said, pouring coffee. James didn't look up. "I dreamed about the pattern again. The one Dad said was important." Grace sat beside him. "Is it the same one you showed Professor Bennett?" James shook his head. "No, it changed last night. Like, it wanted to say more." She brushed his hair gently, heart tightening. She didn't understand what James was drawing, but she understood that something inside him was waking up. Meanwhile, in a motel room 2 towns over, Bennett had pinned every copy of James's drawings across the wall. He hadn't sent them back to Harvard. Not yet. He needed more time, more clarity. He needed to understand what this was before someone else named it for him. At 8:12 a.m., his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. "Professor Bennett?" A clipped female voice replied. "We're aware of the napkin." Bennett straightened. "Who is this?" "Let's just say we represent interests that extend beyond Harvard." "Are you threatening the boy?" "We're watching. Closely. Just remember, some patterns aren't meant to be unlocked too early." The line went dead. That afternoon, Bennett returned to the facility. Grace met him outside the staff entrance, a worried look in her eyes. "He hasn't stopped drawing since last night," she said. "It's like something's pouring out of him." They found James in the cafeteria's back corner, surrounded by a small fortress of napkins, placemats, and paper sheets. He looked up and smiled when he saw Bennett. "I think I found the circle Dad was talking about," he said. He held up a new sheet. It was different now. More than a spiral. It had layers, intersections, paths like circuitry. Bennett's breath caught. "That's not just energy distribution. That's resonance mapping." James blinked. "Is that good?" Bennett smiled. "It's impossible, and yes, very good." He knelt beside James, laying out the other drawings one by one. A picture began to form. Not just a model, a system. Something that didn't just describe energy, it channeled it. Then he noticed something else. Each drawing had a small mark in the corner. A curved shape, almost like an eye. "James," he asked slowly, "where did this mark come from?" James frowned. "It just started showing up. I think Dad used to draw it, but I don't remember when." Bennett froze. He had seen that symbol before, in classified footnotes from a defunct energy division at DARPA, a symbol associated with something that was never supposed to work or survive. He didn't say anything, not yet, because now he knew. This wasn't just about what James was drawing. It was about what someone didn't want him to remember, and the deeper James drew, the closer they got to something that was never meant to wake up. Grace Thompson always said the nights felt longer when James stopped humming. And for the 3rd night in a row, the apartment was silent. No little songs drifting from his room, no pencil scratching napkin paper, just stillness. Heavy, thick, the kind that made the walls feel closer. James hadn't stopped drawing. He just stopped making sound. Each morning she found him asleep on the floor, surrounded by crumpled sketches, loops within loops, geometric spirals nested like Russian dolls, strange grid alignments like star maps turned inward. But something was different now. The drawings were beginning to repeat themselves, with subtle changes. One less angle here, one extra curl there, and always, in the bottom right corner, that same curved symbol, an eye, sometimes open, sometimes shut. Grace didn't know what it meant, but she knew it had started after that night, the night James met Dr. Bennett, and since then James had been quieter, not scared, not withdrawn, but listening, as if something, somewhere, was speaking, in a voice only he could hear. Meanwhile, Dr. Charles Bennett wasn't sleeping either. Back in his motel room, he stared at a wall of diagrams and napkins taped in patterns like constellations. He'd spent 2 decades studying energy systems, from resonance mapping to zero-loss loops, but none of it explained why a child could replicate and improve on models his Harvard team had spent years chasing. Unless it wasn't replication at all. Unless it was remembrance. He zoomed in on a digital scan of one of James's drawings, specifically the symbol in the corner. 3 curves crossing a central arc. He opened an encrypted file he hadn't touched in over a decade, a declassified dossier from Project Aurora. Inside, buried in the footnotes of an energy interface theory dismissed as theoretical psychosis, was a match. Same mark, same shape, only one difference. Aurora had called it Cognitive Residue Identifier, Type 3, Imprint Memory. Bennett's fingers hovered above the keyboard. He didn't want to believe what he was starting to understand. Because if he was right, James wasn't just drawing from inherited genius. He was drawing from a system that had once tried to overwrite his father. That morning, as the sun rose behind a curtain of spring fog, 2 men in black suits knocked on Grace's apartment door. They stood too straight, smiled too little, and had no name tags. The taller one spoke first. "Grace Thompson?" She nodded, already tense. "Who's asking?" The second man held up a silver badge. No seal, no agency, just 3 letters stamped into the metal. DCE. "We'd like to ask you a few questions," the first man said. "About your son." Grace didn't move. Her voice steadied. "Is he in trouble?" "Not at all. We're here for his protection." That was the wrong answer. "I think you should leave." The second man's hand paused on the doorframe. "We understand your concern. This is not a threat. But the nature of what your son is producing has raised interest from multiple agencies." "Such as?" she asked sharply. "Some with less patience than ours." Grace's jaw tightened. "You still haven't told me who you are." The taller one glanced at his partner. "We're from a program that was once part of DARPA. Now, we answer to no flag. We monitor emergent cognitive anomalies, especially when they intersect with archived research from Project Aurora." Grace tried to shut the door, but the second man gently stopped it. "We're not here to hurt him. We're here because others may not be so restrained." She stared into his eyes. "He's just a boy." "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what makes him valuable." 15 minutes later, Bennett's rental car screeched to a stop across the street. He saw the black sedan first, parked crooked, engine off, tinted windows. When Grace opened the door, she looked shaken. "They were here," she whispered. "No names, no questions, just statements, like they already knew who he was." James appeared behind her, holding a new drawing. His bare feet made no sound on the hardwood floor. He looked up at Bennett. "I remembered more," he said. He handed over the paper. Bennett unfolded it. It was more advanced, more layered. The loops now bled into hexagonal pathways. There were curves that followed resonance intervals Bennett had only ever seen in abandoned cold fusion simulations. But something else stood out. The mark in the corner. It had changed. The open eye was now crossed by 3 short lines, vertical, like tally marks. "James," Bennett said carefully, "where did this come from?" James blinked. "I saw it in a dream, but I don't think it's from me." Bennett's stomach dropped. "Then from who?" James didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, to where the black sedan had been. "They're trying to remember something through me," he said softly, "but I don't think it wants to be remembered." That night, Grace packed a duffel bag. Bennett didn't argue. They needed to leave. Again. Farther. Quieter. Off-grid. He had a place in mind. A cabin once owned by a colleague, a mathematician who disappeared into the woods years ago after writing a paper titled The Language of Silence, Energy, Memory, and the Spaces Between. It hadn't been published. It had been retracted, buried. But Bennett had a copy. And now, looking at James's drawings, he saw echoes of it everywhere. They left after midnight. Grace drove. James sat in the back, fingers gently tracing spiral patterns into the condensation on the window glass. As they crossed the state line, James finally spoke. "Professor?" "Yes?" "Why are they scared of me?" Bennett looked back at him. "They're not scared of you," he said slowly. "They're scared of what you might remember next." James nodded, then went back to drawing on the window. By morning they reached the cabin, a quiet wooden house on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by whispering pines. There was no internet, no service. Only one key, hidden beneath a rock shaped like a turtle. Inside, the air smelled of dust and ash. The fireplace was still intact. The shelves still held books no one had read in years. And the table in the center, wide, wooden, worn, was perfect for drawing. James didn't speak. He just sat down, opened his notebook, and began to draw. Bennett watched him for hours, watched as the boy's lines shifted from loops to lattices, watched as the curved marks became gates, symbols that reminded him of old quantum models mixed with tribal iconography. And always, always, silence. James never spoke while he drew. Only when he paused did he whisper, almost to himself, "There's something missing." "What is it?" Bennett asked. James blinked. "Like a sound I almost heard. But it stopped." Bennett leaned forward. "Then try drawing the silence." James tilted his head, and then, slowly, he did. The snow outside the cabin had started to melt. It was still too cold for spring, but the earth beneath the frost was softening, breathing again. Inside, the fire crackled low. James sat at the wooden table in his thick sweater, pencil dancing across a new page. He hadn't stopped drawing since they arrived. Not for food, not for sleep. Dr. Charles Bennett stood nearby, arms crossed, watching in silence. He didn't dare interrupt. The patterns had shifted again, evolved. What once were energy loops and spirals had now become interconnected systems, almost like circuits. But there were no wires, no electricity, only logic, memory, emotion. Bennett leaned in closer, noticing something new on the page. In the lower left corner, James had sketched a curved symbol, not the eye this time. It was almost floral. 3 intersecting arcs, and embedded in the center, 3 vertical lines. The same symbol. Again. "James," Bennett asked gently, "do you know what this is?" James didn't look up. "I think it's from before." "Before what?" A pause. Then, quietly, "Before I could speak." Later that evening, after Grace had made them canned soup and the wind had quieted outside, James finally lay down on the couch, hugging his notebook to his chest like a blanket. Grace gently pulled the cover over him. Bennett was about to stoke the fire when he noticed it. A small part of James's sweater had lifted at the shoulder. There, on his upper back, just under the collarbone, was something etched into the skin. Bennett froze. It wasn't a bruise. It wasn't a birthmark. It was precise, curved, faint, faded with time but unmistakable. He reached forward instinctively, then stopped himself. "Grace," he said softly. She turned. "What is it?" He pointed. She leaned down, brushing back the boy's shirt gently, slowly, and gasped. Etched just under the skin, like a scar, was the same symbol James had been drawing again and again, a curved arc, 3 vertical lines, etched not by hand, but by intention. "Oh my God," she whispered. Bennett didn't speak. He took a photo, sent it through an encrypted channel to one person, a retired contact in Washington he hadn't spoken to in a decade. It was 1:07 a.m. At 1:10 a.m., the reply came. Match confirmed. Level 3 imprint. Code name, Aurora. Bennett's hands shook, not just because the scar had a name, but because Aurora wasn't a theory anymore. It was real. It had been used, and someone had used it on a child. The next morning, James woke to find both Grace and Bennett sitting across from him. They hadn't slept. He looked at their faces, then down at his own arms, as if sensing something had changed. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. "No, sweetheart," Grace said, her voice steady but gentle. "But there's something on your back. Something we didn't know was there." James blinked, then slowly nodded. "I've always felt it." Bennett leaned forward. "Do you remember how you got it?" James looked away. "I think it was after Dad stopped coming home. I thought it was just a scratch. I don't remember it hurting. But I used to wake up hot, like I'd been plugged into something." Grace covered her mouth. Bennett's voice cracked. "James, I don't think you're making this up. I think you're remembering it." James held up his notebook. "I dreamed the symbol last night, but it wasn't mine. I think it belonged to Dad." Bennett stood and walked to the window. The lake outside was still. Trees bent slightly in the wind, but something inside him buzzed, like a frequency he couldn't hear but felt in his bones. "I need to make a call," he said. Grace looked up. "To who?" He hesitated. Then, "To the only person I know who was in the room when Aurora was shut down." 2 hours later, Bennett stood at the edge of the woods with a satellite phone pressed to his ear. The line rang once. Then, "I told you never to call this number." "I wouldn't if I had a choice." Silence. Then a long sigh. "How bad is it?" Bennett looked back toward the cabin. "There's a child, 8 years old. He's recreating a system we buried 23 years ago. Not approximating it. Not guessing. Remembering it." A pause. Then, "Name?" "James Thompson. His father was Robert Thompson, systems engineer at Langley." Silence. Then, low and hard, "I thought he was dead." "He is. But what he carried wasn't." Bennett took a breath. "I need to know everything. Everything you didn't put in the final report. I'll send you what I can. But Charles, listen to me. If the imprint reached the boy, then someone kept the program running. We never finished Aurora. We just scattered it." Bennett clenched his jaw. "I think it found a way back." Back inside, James was sitting cross-legged by the fire, his sweater half off as he sketched. Grace stood behind him, arms wrapped around herself. "Is it getting worse?" she whispered. "No," James said. "It's getting louder." He flipped to a fresh page. But this time, he didn't draw energy. He didn't draw circuits. He drew a face. A man. Bearded. Sad eyes. Strong hands. "Is that your dad?" Grace asked softly. James nodded. He was afraid. Not of dying, of forgetting. He stared at the sketch, then whispered, "I think someone made him forget." That night, Bennett couldn't sleep. He sat at the dining table surrounded by James's drawings, some scattered, others pinned. On each, the symbols began to align, like pieces of a forgotten map. And in the center of them all was a single truth. James was not just a result of Project Aurora. He was the continuation of it. At 3:19 a.m., a dark corridor in a federal archive building blinked to life. A figure stepped through the metal door, placed a file on the table. Across from her, a woman with gray-streaked hair opened it. Inside, copies of James's drawings, photos of the scar, the symbol. She looked up, face pale. "It's the same mark." The man nodded. "Same structure." The woman whispered, "Then we were wrong." The man leaned back, eyes cold. Or too late. Back at the cabin, James curled beside the fire, drawings scattered around him like a soft nest. Bennett sat close by, eyes fixed on the last page James had finished. It wasn't a loop or a spiral, it was a key. And in the center, not energy, but memory. And this time, the silence between the lines wasn't empty. It was waiting. There are places on the map that were never meant to be found. Places that don't appear on GPS, that don't echo in satellite images. Places like Black Hollow. James hadn't heard of it. But the moment Bennett spoke the name, something flickered in his eyes. Not recognition, exactly, but pressure. As if the air itself had thickened around them. "Is that where it started?" James asked quietly. Bennett nodded. "Black Hollow was where Aurora was tested, and where we buried it. No one's supposed to know how to find it. But I do." James didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I think it's where we need to go." They packed in silence. Grace folded James's drawings gently into a thick folder. Her hands trembled, but she didn't protest. She only asked one thing. "Will he be safe?" Bennett met her eyes. "He won't be alone." That was the best he could offer. By dawn, the three of them were in the car, heading east. Grace in the back with James, who stared out the window, fingers tapping gently against the glass in rhythms he couldn't quite name. Black Hollow wasn't on any digital map. It never had an address. It was buried beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains, a Cold War-era bunker originally built to store magnetic tape and nuclear simulations. Later repurposed for Project Aurora, when the theories turned from particle flow to cognition. And when things went wrong, it was sealed, but not destroyed. Because destruction would require admitting it had existed at all. And now, 23 years later, they were going back. As the road narrowed, Bennett drove slower. The trees thickened. Fog rolled across the winding mountain pass. Eventually, the paved road gave way to gravel, then to packed earth. When the forest finally parted, it revealed a strange sight. A metal door, built into the hillside. Rusted, moss-covered. No markings, no guards, just quiet. James stepped out first. He walked up to the door, reached out, and touched it. Then, slowly, he pressed 3 points with his fingers, forming a familiar shape. The arc, the 3 lines, the imprint. A low, mechanical click echoed through the trees. Then a hiss. The door opened. Inside, dust fell like mist. The power was weak but still humming. Rows of abandoned servers lined the corridor like skeletons of a forgotten future. Data terminals blinked faintly, unsure if they were waking up or dying. James walked slowly, eyes scanning the walls as if remembering not where he'd been, but where his father had once stood. At the end of the hallway was a single door, slightly ajar. Bennett pushed it open. The room inside was warm, lit. active. And someone was waiting. She stood with her back to them, gray-streaked hair tied in a knot, wearing civilian clothes, but her posture still military. She turned slowly when she heard the door. "Hello, Charles," she said. Bennett's breath caught. Anna, Dr. Evelyn Hart, once director of Project Aurora, once the woman who said it should be buried, and then disappeared. She looked past Bennett to James. Her expression flickered. Not fear, not regret, recognition. "So you're the one who unlocked it," she said. James stepped behind Bennett. "Who are you?" She gave a faint smile. "I used to build things. Then I spent 20 years making sure no one else finished them." She stepped forward, slowly, hands open, non-threatening. "Aurora was never shut down, Charles. You know that. We didn't kill the theory. We just hid it and waited." "Waited for what?" Bennett asked coldly. Anna looked at James again. "To see who it would wake up in." Grace stepped between them. "Did you do this to my son?" Anna's eyes didn't move. "Not directly. But you knew," Grace whispered. "You knew what would happen to his father." Anna's voice lowered. "His father volunteered. He believed in what we were trying to do. Until he didn't." James stared at her. Calm. Steady. Too steady. "You made him forget." Anna hesitated, then didn't answer. James took a step forward, then another, and reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded page, the latest drawing, the one he hadn't shown anyone. He handed it to her. Anna unfolded it, and paled. "This wasn't supposed to be possible yet," she whispered. Bennett stepped closer. "What is it?" Anna's voice shook. "It's Phase 2. Aurora Phase 2 was a theory, a terrifying one. It suggested that once energy could be mapped through cognition, the next stage would be synchronization, not using the system, but becoming part of it." Anna stared at James, her voice barely audible. "This blueprint, it doesn't just interface. It unbinds." Grace's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "It means," Anna said, "your son just wrote a map to shut the system down, from the inside, without harm." Bennett turned to James, stunned. "You did this?" James didn't blink. "I didn't build anything. I remembered something that wasn't mine. And now I want it to stop." Anna stepped back. "You can't stop what's already activated." James met her gaze. "Then I'll change it." They cleared the center of the room. James knelt, pulled a stick of chalk from his bag, and began to draw the pattern full scale across the concrete floor. Lines, spirals, curved channels, each with mathematical intention and emotional resonance. As the circuit neared completion, the lights in the room began to shift. The walls hummed. Bennett knelt beside him. "Tell me what to do." James looked up, eyes shining, not with power but with peace. "Hold my hand." Bennett did. The moment the final line connected, the room imploded into silence. When Bennett opened his eyes, everything was still. James was breathing, faint but steady. Anna sat against the wall, stunned. Grace ran forward and held her son close, tears falling silently. "What did he do?" Anna asked. Bennett helped James sit up. James smiled. "I turned it off." Anna shook her head. "But the system," James looked at her with the softness of a boy and the clarity of something more. There's no system now. There's just me. Outside Black Hollow, snow had begun to fall again. Quiet, clean, slow. They stepped into the dawn together. No alarms, no sirens, no more ghosts chasing them. Just wind, pine trees, and the soft echo of a world that had waited for someone small enough to remember and brave enough to let go. It began with a letter. No return address, no sender. Just a thick, cream-colored envelope left in the mailbox of a small house near the Maine coast. Inside was a single card, heavy cardstock, smooth texture. One phrase printed cleanly across the center in serif type. The pattern remains. Grace read it twice before she whispered, "Charles." Dr. Charles Bennett was outside fixing the hinge on the back porch. He turned when he heard her voice. She held the card like it might burn her fingers. Bennett frowned, took it, and flipped it over. Nothing on the back, nothing hidden. But folded inside the envelope, there was a photocopy. It was a copy of James's last drawing, the one he had used to shut down Aurora in Black Hollow. But something was wrong. Someone had added to it. Lines that weren't there before. Mirror curves, new intersections, and in the corner, replacing the curved eye with 3 lines, was a new symbol. A crescent arc, open, like a mouth. Waiting. Bennett's hands went cold. James was on the front deck, sketching the shoreline. His golden brown hair was windswept and his shoes were off. He liked the feel of old wood on his feet. Their 3-legged dog, Marble, sat beside him, panting happily. When Bennett walked out holding the letter, James looked up without fear. "They sent something? You knew?" "I felt it," James said. "This morning. Like something old humming through my fingers." He took the copy, studied it, then set it aside with a quiet breath. "I shut down the system, but that wasn't the only part." Bennett sat beside him. "Then what's left?" James tapped his pencil once. "The parts that never believed it was over." That fall, they built a lab in the basement. Not one with blinking lights or humming machines, but with chalkboards, stacks of drawings, and books ranging from particle physics to poetry. Grace called it the listening room, because that's what James was doing now. He wasn't trying to fix anything, or build, or even remember. He was listening to what came after silence. In November, James published a paper under Bennett's name. It was titled Entropy and Empathy, a Theoretical Intersection. It made no mention of Aurora, no energy systems, no equations even. But it shook the academic community. Because within its poetic phrasing, it implied something most physicists refused to admit. That memory carries its own energy. That recognition is not computational, but emotional. That in the heart of chaos lies not disorder, but the clearest kind of order a child can see. The paper ended with a single sentence. What we call anomaly may only be clarity that comes too early. 1 week later, someone broke into the old Black Hollow site. They weren't subtle. They triggered an automatic fail-safe embedded in the walls, a burst field that wiped all remaining electromagnetic storage. Every server, every scan, gone. When Bennett told James, the boy just nodded. Good. Then came the reporter. A woman in her 30s, sharp eyes, voice like polished glass. She didn't say how she found them, only that she knew what questions not to ask. She sat on the porch with James while Marble chased squirrels in the yard. "Was it real?" she asked. James looked up from feeding the dog. "Is gravity real?" "Prove it." James threw a pebble into the yard. It arced, fell, disappeared into leaves. She raised an eyebrow. That's not proof. He smiled faintly. Neither is most of what you write. She laughed, a real one, then left. But she left a card, tucked into the screen door. Not for James, for Bennett. On it were 3 names, all old colleagues, all of whom had recently gone missing. Spring came early that year, and with it, something else. James grew restless. He started waking up in the middle of the night, muttering, walking barefoot to the lake's edge. One morning, Bennett found him kneeling in the sand, eyes closed, whispering numbers. "They're not memories," James said when he returned. "They're faults, like cracks underground. I think they're trying to shift again." Bennett sat beside him. "You mean like earthquakes?" James shook his head. "No, like timelines, trying to rewrite themselves." Then one day, it hit. A storm. But not in the sky. In James. He collapsed in the kitchen, forehead soaked, whispering in rapid sequences. Grace held him. Bennett recorded everything. When James awoke, his voice was hoarse. "It reached me again. I didn't let it in." "Was it Aurora?" Bennett asked. James shook his head. It was what Aurora was talking to. In the weeks that followed, they dug into archives, old notebooks, redacted blueprints, personal letters from engineers who died long before James was born. Again and again, a symbol emerged, the crescent arc, not closed, not watching, but waiting. Sometimes it was scratched into margins, sometimes hidden in data sets, sometimes embedded in blueprints that had nothing to do with energy at all. It had moved beyond physics, into design, into belief. James began writing again, but this time, not equations, letters, to no one in particular. One of them read, "You thought you were building something to control energy, but you were only building a door. And the thing you feared wasn't what was on the other side. It was the part of you that opened it." He folded that letter into a tin box and buried it beneath the pine tree out front. That night, Bennett heard James talking in his sleep, not mumbling, speaking clearly, in a language he didn't know. He recorded it, sent it to a linguist friend in Virginia. The call came at dawn. "It's Proto-Sumerian," the friend said, "but it has mathematical syntax, like someone grafted code into a dead language." "Is it real?" Bennett asked. A long pause. "It shouldn't be." James withdrew again, not out of fear, but focus. He said he could feel when a drawing was wrong. His chest would go cold, and when it was right, marble would bark in his sleep. He said he wasn't drawing from memory anymore. "I'm drawing from presence." One morning, Bennett found him standing at the lake's edge, barefoot, smiling at the ripples. "I think I know what comes after," James said. Bennett stepped beside him. The wind was soft. "What is it?" James turned, eyes blue and still. "You always asked if I was the result of the system. But what if the system was just the result of me?" He skipped a stone. 7 perfect skips, like always. Then he whispered, "I think I can show you." Bennett nodded. "Then let's begin. Again." The lake was still, not just quiet, still. Like something beneath the surface had paused to listen. James stood at the edge, barefoot, morning mist curling around his ankles like threads of thought not yet spoken. Dr. Charles Bennett stood a few steps behind him, arms folded against the chill. "You said you knew what comes after," Bennett said. James didn't turn around. "Not know," he whispered. I feel it. He lifted his hand slightly, as if sensing a shape in the air. Then, the door's not open anymore, but there's echo, like a signal still bouncing around the inside of something that no longer exists. Bennett stepped forward. Echo of what? James finally turned. His eyes looked older than his face. Of everyone who ever tried to become more without becoming whole. That afternoon, they opened a new notebook, this one with a charcoal cover and blank ivory pages. James didn't draw circuits, not at first. He drew layers, shells, like a tree's rings, each one embedded with tiny glyphs, a new language, born from the whispers in his sleep. It wasn't Proto-Sumerian anymore, nor any known form of math. It was something else. Bennett watched, stunned, as James filled the pages in silence, one symbol after another. Lines that curved like wind patterns, circles nested like thoughts returning home. "What is it?" he asked. James answered without looking up. "I think it's what Aurora was trying to listen to." In the following days, James became more deliberate. Each drawing began where the last left off, as if he wasn't sketching different ideas, but slowly unfolding a single thought too large for one page. And in the middle of every page, always, a small, repeated mark, the open arc, the waiting crescent. But something had changed. Inside that crescent, James began inserting reflections, mirror lines, interwoven symbols. They weren't decorative. They were functional. Bennett recognized fragments, harmonics from wave equations, fragments of Fibonacci series, golden ratio arcs. But they weren't in their usual form. They were translated. "You're turning math into language," Bennett whispered. James looked up. "No, I'm turning language back into math." One night, James stood in the basement, barefoot on the chalk-covered floor. The spiral he had drawn that afternoon spanned the entire room, precise to the millimeter, but not measured, drawn from memory. Not memory of the past, but memory of what was coming. He reached the center of the spiral and closed his eyes. Grace and Bennett stood at the edge, silent. Then James whispered, "It's not a pattern. It's a promise." The next morning, an email arrived. No subject, no sender, just one line. "We're seeing it too." Attached was a photo. It was a crop circle, recent, England, but not random. It matched the third spiral James had drawn 2 weeks ago, down to the spacing, and then another email. Different address. Child in Norway. Same drawings. 8 years old. Never taught. Attached, 3 notebook pages. Nearly identical glyphs. Bennett felt a shiver rise up his spine. "It's waking up," he said aloud. James, reading over his shoulder, simply nodded. Pieces. From before. Remembering where they belong. That week, James stopped drawing altogether. Not because he was done, because he was ready. "I need to go somewhere," he said. Bennett frowned. "Where?" James walked to the shelf and pulled out an old folded paper, a topographical map of Appalachia. He pointed to a small cluster of lines, half faded with time. "Here." Grace looked over his shoulder. "There's nothing there." James smiled softly. "Not anymore." They drove 2 states south, hiking the last 5 miles on foot. James never looked at the map. He just walked. Like he had been there before, in some other skin, some other time. Eventually, the trees opened to reveal what looked like the remains of an old observatory. Its dome collapsed, metal ribs jutting out like the skeleton of a giant eye turned inward. James stepped over fallen beams and shattered tiles. In the very center of the ruin was a circular platform, cracked, moss-covered, but unmistakably drawn with intention. He knelt. Bennett approached slowly. "Why here?" James traced the outline of a broken tile. "Dad used to tell me stories about how humans used to look up for answers." He looked up. But maybe what we needed to remember was never in the stars. Maybe it was beneath them. He pulled out the charcoal notebook and placed it flat on the stone. The wind blew gently, flipping pages, but only backward, until it stopped, on a blank spread. James placed his hand on the left page, then his right hand on the stone. He closed his eyes. Something shifted. Not in the wind, not in the ground, in the quiet, like a breath held across time. Then, a faint vibration beneath their feet. Grace stepped back. Bennett tensed. James opened his eyes, calm, aware. "It's not a place," he said softly. "It's a keyhole." They stayed until nightfall. James drew nothing new, said nothing more. Only before they left, he took a piece of broken tile and drew a single arc in the dirt beside the platform. But not open this time. Closed. Complete. "What does that mean?" Grace asked. James looked up at the stars. "It means the first part is over." Back in Maine, things quieted again. James returned to feeding marble, to sketching the ocean in chalk on the back porch. But something in him had shifted, not withdrawn, integrated. He still hummed in the kitchen, still asked questions, but he didn't draw the spiral anymore. He began building something else. Not from graphite, not from code, but from wood, thread, and stone. He called it the listening gate. When asked what it did, he simply said, "It doesn't transmit. It doesn't receive. It reminds." One evening, Grace found him at the gate, holding a folded letter. "Did someone send it?" she asked. James shook his head. "I think I wrote it to myself, from a version of me that knew something I hadn't remembered yet." She opened it slowly. Inside, written in neat cursive, was just one line. The silence was never empty. It was waiting for you to listen back. It began once again with silence, but this time it wasn't empty. James stood on the front porch at dawn, barefoot, eyes closed. The wind off the coast was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of salt and memory. He opened his hand slowly. In his palm sat a stone, no bigger than a coin, with 3 concentric rings carved into its surface. Perfect circles. Not recent. Not man-made. "Where did you find it?" Dr. Charles Bennett asked from behind him. James didn't turn. "I didn't find it. Marble did." The 3-legged dog was curled on the deck, tail twitching in sleep. Grace, watching from the kitchen window, shivered. "It looks like the center of your older drawings." James nodded. "That's because it is, but not drawn. Remembered." He turned to Bennett. "There's an archive, but it's not where people look. It's not in servers, not in satellites. It's beneath us." Bennett's voice was quiet. "What kind of archive?" James held up the stone, turned it in the light. "A living one." That same morning, Bennett received a message from an old colleague. Encrypted, urgent. The subject line read, "Pattern detected beneath Site Echo 9. No body, no signature, just a set of coordinates in the Appalachian foothills, not far from where they'd found the ruined observatory." Bennett looked at James. "Does this mean anything to you?" James studied the coordinates, eyes scanning like a compass tuning itself. "It's not the place itself. It's what's under it." They packed light. Grace wanted to come, but James stopped her. "This part isn't for you, Mom. But it started with you. So I'll bring it back." She hugged him tighter than usual. "Be careful." He smiled gently. "I won't be alone." They drove 6 hours, then hiked the final miles through thick trees. The coordinates led them to a nondescript stretch of forest. No trail markers, no signs, just moss and earth and wind. "It's quiet," Bennett whispered. James shook his head. "No, it's waiting." Then he knelt and pressed his palm against the ground. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then, beneath their feet, the faintest vibration, like a breath through stone. And then, the ground split. Silently. Smoothly. A hidden entrance revealed itself beneath the roots. Not mechanical, not rusted steel like Black Hollow. This was older, organic. The stone corridor that emerged curved downward in a spiral, walls etched with the same glyphs James had been drawing for months. As they descended, the air grew cooler, but not stale. It smelled like old books and iron and rain-soaked moss. The walls pulsed faintly, not with light, with memory. James brushed his fingers across one. Immediately, images flashed through his mind. Not his. Not exactly. A woman in 1943 whispering equations into a notebook she would later burn. A boy in Tunisia drawing spirals in the sand before the war came. A group of children in Brazil forming loops with string across their fingers in a shape they didn't know had meaning. All disconnected. All the same pattern. All across time. James stumbled slightly, breathing hard. "They stored it in us," he gasped. "Not data, presence. That's why it couldn't be deleted." Bennett steadied him. "Who did?" James looked up at him, eyes distant. "We did." At the base of the spiral tunnel stood a single door. Stone, engraved with 3 arcs and a spiral curl at the center. No lock, no handle. James stepped forward and laid both hands against it. It opened without a sound. Inside was not what Bennett expected. Not servers, not machines, but walls. Walls of etched memory, drawings, names, fragments of languages, coordinates, shapes, stories. The inner memory of humanity, archived not by technology, but by resonance. James walked slowly, one finger trailing along a wall of names. He stopped at one. Robert A. Thompson. His father's name, etched not as a data point, but as a node. James pressed the stone he'd found into the space below the name. It fit perfectly. A sound filled the room, low, harmonic, like 1,000 voices humming the same note from far away. Then, above the stone, something bloomed. Not light, but understanding. A memory. Not a recording. Not an image. A living emotion. James felt his knees buckle. He fell to the floor, and he saw. His father, sitting alone in a dim room beneath Langley, head in hands, whispering, "We thought we could shape energy with intention. But the truth is, energy always had shape. We were the ones who forgot how to feel it." Then, a gentle touch. His father turning to the camera. "If you're seeing this, it means the system outlived me. But if you're seeing this, and you're my son..." His voice breaks. "I tried to protect you. I didn't mean to leave the door open. But maybe you're the one who was always meant to close it. Not with force, but with understanding." The image faded. James was crying, but his hands were steady. "He didn't die with the system," James whispered. "He died so it wouldn't become one." Bennett Nellie knelt beside him, his throat dry. "James, what is this place?" James looked up, wiped his tears. "It's not a place." He stood looking around the chamber. "It's a mirror." They stayed until dusk. James touched wall after wall, but only once. He said each one sang differently. Each memory echoes forward and backward, like pages in a book we haven't finished writing, but that already remember how the story ends. Before leaving, James took one last look at the chamber. He placed his notebook in a hollow near the door, a quiet offering. A page still blank. Then the door closed behind them, stone folding into root, root into ground, ground into silence. Back in Maine, Grace met them at the door. Her eyes locked on James. "Did you find it?" James nodded. "I found all of us." That night, he wrote only 3 words in his new notebook. "The memory listens." There was no wind that morning, no crashing tide, no bird song, only stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. James stepped outside, barefoot as always, and walked to the edge of the bluff behind their house. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, silver under the rising sun. But he wasn't looking at the sea. He was listening, with his body. Dr. Charles Bennett watched from the doorway, mug of tea warming his hands. Grace stood behind him, silent. They both knew the rhythm now, knew not to interrupt. James had changed after returning from the archive. He still smiled, still played with marble. But there was something else in him now, a kind of clarity that didn't need expression, because it was already understood. That afternoon he sat in the living room with a ball of twine and 3 sticks. No paper, no pencil. He began tying the twine in loops between the sticks, forming a triangle. Then he sat back, tilting his head. Grace walked by, paused, and stared. "What is it?" James looked up, calm. "A sentence." She smiled gently. "But there are no words." James held up the triangle. "Not everything we mean comes in letters." Then he touched the top knot of the twine. "This says, 'I see you, but I don't expect you to explain.'" Grace's eyes welled up, and she didn't know why. By that evening, 5 more triangles filled the room, each one with different curves, spacing, twine tension, like musical notes suspended in shape. Bennett sat across from him, notebook open. "This is communication?" James nodded. "Not to teach, not to instruct, to remember. The kind of knowing that doesn't need to pass through the mouth." He gently pushed one triangle toward Bennett. "This one means, what you feared wasn't the truth. It was the feeling that came with it." Bennett looked down, throat tight. "James, how are you creating this? Where is it coming from?" James didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he closed his eyes and began drawing in the air, not with fingers, not shapes, but movement, like a dance reduced to essence. His arms moved slowly, deliberately, a spiral, a circle, a pause, a gentle shake of the wrist. Bennett felt his chest tighten. Not from fear, from recognition. He had seen these motions before, in his dreams. That night, after James fell asleep, Grace found Bennett still sitting at the dining table, scribbling furiously in the margin of an old Aurora report. She glanced at the pages. "What are you trying to find?" Bennett didn't look up. I'm trying to prove something that can't be proven. That he's not speaking in code? That he's speaking in understanding. And that it's been here all along. The next morning, they received a package. No postmark, no return address. Just a single flash drive and a note. We hear him, but we don't know how. The flash drive contained footage, surveillance clips from around the world. A young girl in Morocco drawing loops in the dirt, then dancing around them in a spiral. A boy in South Korea blinking in deliberate sequences that mimicked James's triangle patterns. A group of children in Finland humming 3 notes, not random, but matching the tone James had hummed weeks earlier in his sleep. They weren't copying. They were echoing. James watched in silence, then whispered, "It's not mine. It's us. It was always us." That evening, James sat with Grace on the back porch. She had stopped asking questions. She simply sat, letting the silence settle between them like a shared blanket. "Do you miss your dad?" she asked softly. James looked out at the trees. "Not really." Then after a moment, "Because he's not somewhere else. He's here. When I close my eyes, he doesn't speak. But I feel what he meant." He tapped his chest gently. That's the new language. Not just meaning, but felt meaning. Direct. She put her hand over his, and suddenly, she understood. Not with her brain, not with logic, but with grief and love. And something more primal. It felt like someone had translated her silence into forgiveness. Later that week, Dr. Evelyn Hart called. Her voice trembled through the line. "Charles, it's happening again." "What is?" "We're seeing data correlations across systems. Not AI, not algorithms, kids, seniors, veterans, blind people. They're dreaming. The same glyphs." Bennett said nothing. "It's like someone whispered something too big, and now everyone's trying to hum it back." Then she said more softly, "We thought Aurora was a system." "It wasn't," Bennett replied. "It was a tuning fork." That night, James walked out into the clearing behind their house. He laid down in the grass, arms open. Above him, the stars looked closer than they had any right to. He began to hum. 3 notes. The same ones from the surveillance clip in Finland. The same ones buried in an Aurora test file labeled Origin Pulse. Thought to be machine interference. But they weren't interference. They were invitation. The next morning, Marble barked wildly at the fence. There, etched into the wood by no human hand, was a symbol, one James had never drawn, but somehow always known. A circle, with 2 broken lines slicing across it like parentheses. Open, welcoming. James didn't speak. He just traced it with his fingers and whispered, "They're listening back." That day he built a new triangle, larger, heavier. He hung it in the center of the living room and tied a single thread from its top point to a nail above the fireplace. It didn't swing, didn't hum. It just rested. Until dusk, when it moved on its own. Grace gasped. "What was that?" James turned slowly. It answered. That night, the stars blinked, not all at once, but in a pattern, like breathing. James stepped outside. Bennett followed. They stared together in silence. "Do you see it?" James asked. Bennett blinked, eyes moist. "Yes." "Do you understand it?" "No." James smiled. "You don't have to. That's what comes next." The final page had always been there. At the very end of the charcoal notebook, James carried since Black Hollow, crisp, untouched, its corners still sharp while the others had frayed. He'd skipped it every time. Drawn, written, tied, and folded on dozens of others. But not this one. Not yet. It was late March. The sea was starting to warm, and the wind carried the distant scent of pine sap and melted frost. James hadn't spoken all morning, not with words. He walked barefoot across the yard, cupping a small stone in his hand, the same stone from months ago, now etched deeper from his fingers, rubbing it during thought. Grace and Bennett watched from the window. They knew the signs now. Not to follow, not to speak. James wasn't disappearing. He was becoming visible to something old, something quiet, something that had never stopped listening. He reached the bluff and sat down. Not on a rock, not on the grass. He sat directly on the earth, spine aligned with the wind, palms open to the sky, and in front of him he placed the notebook, still closed, still waiting. For over an hour he didn't move, didn't draw, didn't hum, only breathed. It wasn't meditation, it wasn't trance. It was communion, not with a deity, not with a machine. With the question that had lived beneath every drawing, every scar, every silence since he first picked up a pencil by the vending machine in NASA's back kitchen. What if I wasn't remembering the past, but being remembered by it? Behind him, Grace finally stepped outside. She didn't say anything, just wrapped a shawl over his shoulders and kissed the top of his head. "You don't have to finish anything, sweetheart," she said. "I know," James replied softly. "That's why it's ready." When the sun reached the center of the sky, James opened the notebook to the final page. It made no sound. He stared at the blankness, felt it, like an ear pressed to time itself. Then, with a single breath, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin needle and a spool of white thread. Not a pencil, not chalk, thread. He pierced the top left corner of the page and began stitching. Small, curved loops, precise. Each stitch placed not with calculation, but with memory that didn't need facts. Because truth had never been the point, only belonging. By the time he finished, the stitched thread formed a single shape, an open hand. Inside it, a spiral. Around it, 3 lines like sun rays. Below it, a single arc. Closed. No caption, no symbols. Just felt language, woven instead of written. He folded the notebook, then turned to Grace and Bennett. "It's done." Bennett stepped forward, eyes wide. What is it?" James smiled. "A quiet, not to silence us, but to carry us." That night, they placed the notebook under the pine tree where the tin box had once been buried. They didn't bury it. They left it in the crook of 2 roots, like an offering to the memory of soil itself. Then James whispered, "This page never needed words, just someone to arrive." In the weeks that followed, the world didn't change. Not with thunder, not with breaking news, not with headlines or celebrations, but with small things. A child in South Africa stopped stuttering when she placed 3 stones in a triangle and hummed. A man in Berlin who'd lost his wife began hearing her laugh again when he closed his eyes, only when he traced a curve across his palm. An elderly woman in Peru, alone for decades, began speaking to plants. And they bloomed. No one called it aurora. No one called it science, because it was neither. It was remembrance. Bennett stopped teaching. He began listening instead, hosting circles, not lectures. Places where people could sit in silence with shapes and chords and let themselves recall what had never been taken, only buried. Grace started baking again. She said the dough rose better when James placed one of his string triangles above the oven. She didn't ask why. She just felt it. And James? He stopped drawing because he no longer needed to pull something out of himself. He was the drawing now, living, listening, not teaching, not proving, just offering space for the quiet to breathe. One evening, as spring bled into summer, Bennett found James lying in the grass behind the house. Eyes closed, hands folded over his chest. He looked peaceful. But something pulsed in the air. Not light, not temperature. Presence. "Are you okay?" Bennett asked. James opened his eyes. "Better than okay." He sat up, stretched. "I just heard someone say thank you. Not with a voice, with a relief." "Who?" James looked at the horizon. "All of us." The next morning, a new page appeared in the notebook. The one they'd left under the tree. Not written by James. Not written at all. Just a faint fingerprint, pressed into the corner. Small, delicate, real. And under it, in letters that weren't ink but indentation. The first page is always waiting. And somewhere far from Maine, maybe beneath a mountain, or behind a forgotten door. A soft hum echoed through stone. No machines, no code, no surveillance. Just resonance, the kind that doesn't ask to be understood, only felt, only remembered, and maybe, just maybe, ready to be written again.